Hello Sword fam, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm Brittany, and today I'm going to be talking about a brand new book that just got released into the sword community. It is German Longsword by Kyle Griswold, and I think it is going to be an exceptional resource for beginners, solo practitioners, or anybody looking to get into the German system of study for swordsmanship. This is a paperback book, and I'm going to just fully disclose all of the background to it. I'm mostly excited for it because I think it's a really excellent resource, but I'm going to be really transparent. I ended up doing a lot of the modeling for the photos in this book, so you might see me a few times in it. So I was really happy to collaborate with this project. It was also supported by my sword school, Mordhau Historical Combat, and the author, Kyle Griswold, is the co-founder of my sword school, so he's the co-founder of Mordhau Historical Combat, but he also, totally by coincidence, happens to be my husband. So full transparency that, yeah, I'm super excited to be promoting this product, and because it is my husband, I think that's useful information. But overall, I think that he worked so hard on the book, and I know the amount of time, effort, and research that he put into it that I was so happy to help him however I could and make sure that this resource got out to the community, because having run a sword school for so many years now, we decided that what was really missing in the community was a resource like this, and Kyle basically spearheaded that project and produced this. It's currently only available in paperback, and I believe a Kindle or a PDF version is coming out shortly, if not already. And this is being published by Broken Blade Publishing, and you can find that on the link below. One of the things I really loved about this project is just how many different people in the sword community came together to really make this happen. So I ended up signing on to do some of the modeling for the photos, and so did our good friend Shane Gibson. Shane runs the Verde Valley Historical Fencing just a few hours north of us here in Arizona, so it was kind of nice to work with him and get some photos done. And of course, the photography was all done by John Murray, who is like, well, first he's one of my students, but if you follow me on Instagram at all of those really beautiful professional photos, those are all John. And so it was like a no-brainer to be able to use somebody local who has a hand in the community. He's been to lots of tournaments. And so being able to use a photographer who knows sword stuff and really get the right angles to show the best possible image for like really difficult techniques makes a huge difference for that book. Artists within the sword community also contributed to this book. The cover image here was hand illustrated by Mariana Lopez, and this isn't just a copy paste of like taking a PDF version or like a digital version of Meyer and then like, you know, deleting out the background to make it transparent and then slapping it on the book. No, Mariana actually like drew this entire image so that it could be used for this cover. So it is a unique illustration that she had done for this book, and she's very prominent in the community as well. Dylan Smith was the other artist who signed on for this project. He has been in the community for a very long time. In fact, he's a tattoo artist who has tattooed some of the biggest names in North America for sword fighting. In fact, I have a tattoo from him, not this one, and lots of other folks that we know. He's also done several logos for different sword events or different sword schools. In fact, he did the logo for my sword school, Mordhau Historical Combat. Another notable contribution that makes this book kind of exciting is that the translations that Kyle used for this book to develop his interpretations were actually translations that were done by Stephen Chaney. And if you don't know who Stephen Chaney is, allow me to take a second to introduce you. Stephen Chaney is the translator who basically made this book. Some of you might have seen it before on my Instagram. It's definitely floating around a lot in the HEMA community right now. This is the Ringek Danzig Lev Longsword book that has all the different translations side by side so that you can make direct comparisons. And so Stephen allowed Kyle to use his translations from this book so that Kyle could make his interpretations to write this book. So it's kind of cool how these two are connected. And I highly recommend this. We use this all the time in class at Mordhau Historical Combat, but that's not what this video is about. This was edited by Quinn Richardson, who is a student of mine, and he's a fencer, so he's very involved in the HEMA community, and his knowledge of just HEMA in general and history actually made editing this book really, really special. I think Kyle actually had another editor lined up at one point, but because the editor wasn't familiar with like historical European martial arts or the jargon in the community or some of the very obscure and sometimes archaic terminology and language, the editor wasn't really a good fit. So Quinn had signed on because he had that knowledge already. And so he was a perfect fit to be able to edit a book like this. And so again, just more community contribution to make this happen. Kyle definitely had a really good idea in gathering all these different people to help him in some way to make this book happen, because then it's not just an echo chamber of, here's my ideas and they're right and I don't think there's any difference. Because one of the worst things that can possibly happen is when you get a book put out and it's sort of just like this very isolated idea of how swordsmanship should be, and it's not really in line with the experiences of the community. So I think Kyle did a really good job with his interpretations, trying to gather as many different ideas as possible and consult with people, make sure it makes sense, and so having this be a community effort ends up really being what I think is a really valuable resource just for anybody. So let's just dive right into why I think this book is actually useful. For beginners and solo practitioners, this book actually starts with a historical context. The historical context provides you information on the system that you're studying. So Kyle goes on to talk about what the Zettel is, who Lichtenauer was, what the source material is, and how we interpret it. And the reason this is important is because if you're a solo practitioner or a beginner, this sort of context of KDF can be very overwhelming, and when you try to just solo study it, you can be really overwhelmed. So having that little preface there really helps contextualize the book that you're about to read and makes it a lot more accessible to new people to understand. It also starts with fundamentals. Now again, this is just a longsword book. So KDF as a system covers several different weapons, but this one is longsword specific. The information in the book is presented in an order that I think is actually very intuitive to help build your knowledge. So it starts with the historical context. It kind of puts you within the system, so you kind of know what's coming, how to understand like why it is and how it is and when it was. And then it goes into really basic stuff, sword anatomy. And then of course, it starts you with, before you even get into the Hauptstücke, it starts you with describing what Zufechten is, what Vornock and Indis are, and things that aren't necessarily just explicit in the source material until you start getting through the glosses. And so Kyle actually starts off with that, thinking that it's very fundamental information to be able to digest the rest of it. What makes this really valuable for beginners and especially solo practitioners is that this book not only covers the historical techniques, but also the physical way to hold your body. So Kyle, at the very beginning of the book, goes over your posture. He actually has a section on footwork, for example, and these are things that can easily just get lost, right? Or you don't know where to find that information. A lot of the historical sources don't actually talk about footwork very specifically at all, and if they do, it's usually just like the right foot steps here. What it doesn't talk about is where the knee needs to be oriented to avoid, injury or stuff like that, and trying to find balance. So he makes it very explicit. He has lots of really good pictures with grids to help you understand that. Again, super useful for a beginner or somebody who's solo practicing. There's also a translated version of the Zettel. The translation, as I mentioned, is from Stephen Chaney. And so that really helps, again, in the context. You also have an easy reference for the Zettel if you ever need it, so you don't have to go onto the Lichtenauer, track it down, try and find it, and it becomes kind of difficult sometimes. But it's right there, it's super easy. He also made it super useful visually because the Hauptstücke within the Zettel are highlighted in red. So you can see Krump, Zwerch, Schiller, Scheitel, all of these, they're all highlighted in red. And then of course, in true Lichtenauer KDF fashion, Kyle goes through each of the 17 Hauptstücke, starting with Zorn, going to Krump, etc. The other selling point of this book is the quality of the photos. Their color, first of all, which is really useful, and he identifies each fencer in the images as either the red fencer or the blue fencer, and that helps make it really clear what's going on. The photography also uses angles, and then the images themselves have arrows to identify the movement of the sword, the direction of the body, and then using those photography angles to make certain things a lot more clear. Especially when we're dealing with moving in space and then trying to interpret that information on a 2D medium, you lose a lot of depth, and sometimes it can be easy to not be sure what's going on. So the photographer, John Murray, did a really excellent job of doing photography over the shoulder or from above or below, so that you can really get an idea of where the sword is making contact or where the sword is binding on another one, whether it's strong or weak. And that's what makes this book really cool, is the images are exceptionally clear about what's going on. Not only does Kyle go through the 17 Hauptstücke in really nice detail with great photos and great explanations, he also includes a whole section on additional techniques. So some of those things are like schnappen or half swording, or cuts that you don't normally see in the Hauptstück themselves, such as middle cuts, and then there's also Ringen am Schwert. He covers that in its own section. We also have the whip cut, a whole bunch of things that aren't necessarily specific to the 17 Hauptstücke, but are essential to being able to do KDF as a whole. In fact, he even has a whole note on the Prellhau, which, once you know what that is, you probably will be delighted to know that it's in this book. And in keeping with the theme of making this a very valuable and useful resource for beginners, solo practitioners, or anyone trying to just gain more information on KDF, Kyle includes a whole glossary and index. So he has Absätzen, for example. He gives the German term, the English term, setting off the page that you can find that section, and then a very brief description on what that means as a quick reference. And because I'm a nerd, I really appreciate that there's endnotes, and I can then go through all the different source material and resources that Kyle used and basically just start going down a whole rabbit hole of really cool resources. So in summary, I think this is truly a really fabulous book, and not just because it's my husband's book, but because I know the amount of effort that was put into it, the amount of people that contributed to it within the community that decided this was a project worth putting their names on in some way or form as artists or photographers. And of course, the fact that it was super well received by our students, and Kyle made it for our students. Seeing how our beginners wanted to get more information, but showing up to class every week wasn't always just enough. There needed to be a resource available, and he just took that bull by the horns and produced what I think is probably the best book right now on getting involved in KDF, how to get started as a beginner if you're a solo practitioner. And again, if you're an instructor and you're just looking for ways to share the information that is slightly different, or if you're looking for an easier way to explain something, or maybe even just a different way to explain something, I think this will be really helpful. German Longsword by Kyle Griswold will be available directly through Broken Blade Publishing and other vendors throughout North America and Europe. I'll include those vendors below if you want to take a look. And as always, friends, thank you so much for watching, thank you so much for your support, and happy reading!